Okay, so you've told me a lot about what you do, how you help people. Now I'm interested to know a bit more about yourself, Michael. How you got to where you are today, how you got started in bioenergy healing treatment, and what was behind you looking for such alternative therapies. Could you just give me a brief history?
My background's very interesting because I didn't plan to become a practitioner. Prior to being a practitioner, I had an organic food shop with a juice bar, and that was very fulfilling for me. And I then met, through one of my customers, a gentleman who introduced me to some primary bioenergy healing techniques. And when I experienced them, it was like, for me, it was very unique because it was as if it was something that was already inside me, but I didn't know it was there and I didn't know how to access it. So it was very, very unique. And from starting to utilize those primary techniques and through working with clients, and time as went by, as the technique evolved, new techniques enhanced and evolved thereafter.
The guy that approached you and said was introduced you to bioenergy. What made him do that? Did he see that there was something wrong with you? Or
I had what I should talk about really is my history here, because prior to this meeting, I had a history of problems. From the age of 14, I had major spinal problems. When I was 14 years old, I was playing a game of badminton, and I came out of the badminton with a S-shaped spine. Okay, it's called scoliosis, and literally my spine was like this, and I was like that for 6 months. I sought treatment. I actually had some acupuncture at the time. And I also saw various orthopedic surgeons. We had the x-rays, we had the scans. And when I reflect back, and the memories that I'm left with were them turning around to me and say, Michael, look at your mum. And what they meant was, my mother had a history of back problems as well. So that's what I was going to be expecting as I was to grow up. And her discs in her neck were degenerative, and therefore that's what was ahead of me. And from that point onwards, spinally and mentally, confidently, I lacked everything.
of course, because if someone tells you you're going to live with that forever,
Absolutely.
surely it must knock a bit out of you.
And for me, it was 20 years of living like that. And over those 20 years, what I experienced was a repetitive injury. I had hypermobility, so literally I would open up a limb like my elbow here, and rather than my ligaments and tendons stopping me, I would actually overexpose the arm, and then I'd injure myself. I was diagnosed with Sherman's disease, which means my vertebrae aren't fully formed. It's like, okay, and I had 3 degenerate discs, T12, L1 and T4. I couldn't lift up my kids, I couldn't do any exercise, I couldn't do anything physical. And if I did, I ended up on my back for a week. And I lived like this, and then even at one point, about 10 years ago, I had one of the worst experiences possible, where I got chronic sciatica, and for 6 months I lived on my lounge floor in dire pain. And I made a partial recovery in the sense that I get myself back up on my feet. But that was my life, that was Michael. I had no strength in my body, no tonnage in my body, and naturally I also didn't have any mental strength because of that as well.
Okay, so with bioenergy healing treatment, of course, it's a process that takes time. You know, your body needs to heal. How did you get the motivation, once someone taught you the techniques, to continue doing it, even though you probably necessarily didn't maybe see results as soon as, like...
The motivation wasn't something that I had to think about. As I mentioned to you before, it was as if it was something that I was able to do without knowing I was able to do, and it just became part of the norm for me. It wasn't thinking, oh, I need to wake up, I better go and do a treatment session today. It was just it became part of my routine.
Sure.
So I started treating myself every day, and by treating myself every day enabled me to move forward. I wasn't caught up with, I've got to get this dealt with tomorrow. I'd already been living it for 20 years. So I wasn't caught up with the frustrations that must happen tomorrow. And I didn't know what to expect either. All I knew was I was able to work with the technique, and not only was I able to work with the technique, I was actually getting results. And one of the major results that came through was in respect to my intolerances. I, for 16 years, had major intolerances to...
Is that food intolerance? Sorry.
Well, that's one aspect, there's food. So I was intolerant to 16 different types of food, including the main grains like wheat, rice, barley, oats, as well as a whole other concoction of other foods. So I had those intolerances. I also was hypersensitive to noise, pollution, chemicals, material, people, buildings, electronic equipment. My sensitivity meant that my life was about balancing on this very narrow fence, and it took very little to not be off it. And what happened was, when I started to work with my treatment on myself, I didn't target, right, I better try and sort out this intolerance or this hypersensitivity or my spinal problem. What happened was, I worked the scanning technique on myself, and as the jigsaw pieces slotted into place, so did the shifts start taking place on a physical and psychological level. So, example, my food intolerances. I hadn't eaten bread for 3 years, and then me and Jo, my wife, we went to the New Forest for one weekend, and we ended up staying in a hotel. And that night of staying in the hotel, I had a huge problem with the kitchen staff, trying to get them to understand I can't eat this, I can eat that, and I want a bit more than a bit of lettuce and tomato. So got through the night. We had a meal, a very nice meal, but the next morning, I turned around to Jo at the kitchen, at the dining table, and I said, Jo, I want some toast. And she said, what do you mean you want some toast? You can't eat bread. Sure. I said, I would like some toast. I can eat it. And I did. And what happened there was I was able thereafter to reintroduce those foods into my diet, sure, which I couldn't eat for many years.
Okay, so this must have had a huge impact on your family. I mean, how did your wife, Jo, deal with all of this for how long? 16 years you're talking about food intolerances, 20 years for the back pains. It's
absolutely.
She must have been going through hell to a certain degree to try and help you, or...
What people don't seem to understand is, number one, like my clients, I lived with certain symptoms, and that's hard. My symptoms were very physical, they were emotional, and they affected me on a psychological level, naturally. But what people don't necessarily fully comprehend is what it's like for those people looking after you and caring for you around you. And that's very hard. So, particularly with my food intolerances, I was a nightmare in the kitchen. Jo didn't know where to turn to what to make. And that's very hard. And because I had sensitivities to a wide range of foods, it meant that she was looking at every ingredient label, trying to work out, can Michael eat it, can he not? And then not forgetting there's some hidden ingredients in foods which you don't know about, but I had that hypersensitivity that I was affected by it. The kids, they found it very, very challenging because I was different.
Sure.
I wasn't just like a normal person who could just eat whatever served on the table. So it's very challenging for the children and for Jo, in a similar way it is for my clients and their families.